So as I watched the response from Russia and the Kremlin pertaining to this aid package being voted into law and Ukraine likely getting the aid sometime in the near future, it has become increasingly clear to me that Russia was not expecting this to pass. Now granted, the aid package went from not happening at all to passing the House very quickly due to a stunning reversal from Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. Even I was surprised, but I don't think I was as surprised as the Russians were. Now, based on their reactions, it's clear they had no backup plan. Assuming no help would come Ukraine's way, they thought that no further aid packages would be heading to Ukraine because there was enough Russian support in Congress to keep it from happening, and the threat of unseating yet another Speaker of the House loomed. And this would also ultimately mean Europe and their support would start to wane. And rather than seeing talks of additional weapons going to Ukraine, there would now be talks of a Ukrainian surrender for the good of the world. That is what the Kremlin was banking on, that the Ukraine fatigue would grow so great that they would ultimately win. Well, that didn't happen, and Russia is stunned by that at this point. Russia is now realizing that Ukraine, with Western support, will effectively continue to dismantle the modern components of the Russian military, pushing their capabilities back decades. With this and European aid now coming online over the next year, Russia might be left with only outdated weaponry and traditional World War I human wave combat tactics. I mean, we're seeing Russia refurbish decades-old equipment, and I mean decades old, not just like a couple decades, like 5-6 decades old equipment to try to make them combat ready. Meanwhile, the Russian Air Force, even the previously untouchable strategic bombers and the Russian Navy are being severely impacted by Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet is on the verge of being combat ineffective at this point. Meanwhile, NATO and China are consistently upgrading their arsenals with advanced technology. And while it appears China and Russia are on friendly terms on the surface, it bears repeating that Russia and China have actually fought a kinetic fight more recently than China and any NATO country, and for that matter, Russia and any NATO country have fought. There continues to be an ongoing border dispute between Russia and China that China actually has complained about in the last year. So both countries are aware of each other's capabilities. Russians are starting to realize that their strategy in Ukraine is failing and that they are now far more vulnerable than before this war, both economically and militarily. Multiple threats have come out of the Duma aimed at Russia's future goals of taking the Baltics and Poland, burning down Berlin, destroying London, etc. Even before the war in Ukraine, Russia's chances of doing these things was very slim. Now with their losses in Ukraine, their chances are essentially zero. The aid to Ukraine effectively acts as an ultimatum aimed at Russia. Stop your war in Ukraine, or watch as the US and Europe fund the destruction of your modern military without losing a single NATO soldier and spending less than 10% of NATO's total budget to do it. Furthermore, the inclusion of weaponry that Ukraine didn't have in mass amounts, such as ATACMS, and the funding for F-16s now puts things like the Crimean Bridge in range. That's a pretty juicy target, which would be a very painful loss for the Russians. The Kremlin seems to know this, as their recent comments have a larger amount of salt than usual. Russian officials Dmitry Medvedev and Dmitry Peskov had comments that were tinged with disjointed frustration, bitterness, and a want to wildly lash out. On seizing Russian assets, Peskov said, "If this really involves confiscating our assets, the U.S. will face consequences. Moscow will respond based on our interests without any time constraints." He went on to talk about the aid to Ukraine. This decision will further enrich the U.S. while making Ukraine poorer, and the result is more Ukrainian casualties. Dmitry Medvedev went harder against the U.S., saying the vote reflects the glee of American fools to perpetuate the division within our historically unified nation and to increase the death toll in this conflict. We are determined to prevail despite the $61 billion directed towards their relentless military-industrial complex. We believe truth and power are on our side. He went on to say, given the anti-Russian sentiment behind this decision, I sincerely wish the U.S. to quickly descend into its own civil war, vastly different from their 19th century conflict, potentially involving aircraft, tanks, artillery, and various missiles, leading to the disgraceful downfall of what he called a vile empire of the 21st century, also known as the United States. That was comments from Medvedev, and while good on him for really kind of having a nice word salad there, there's some things that just aren't happening anytime soon, despite what he and Peskov say. The US is not going to descend into a civil war. Any political angst in the US over Ukraine or other matters that we're discussing isn't even on the level of rampant in-person violent confrontations at this point. It's basically just name-calling by anonymous folks on the internet. So the US is here to stay, and I'm not sorry about that. No one should be. It's a better world when the US is here, ensuring that the global rules-based order is still in place. And second, the only thing causing Ukrainian casualties are the Russians. So if Peskov and Medvedev are so concerned about Ukrainian casualties, pack your crap and get out of Ukraine. That is when people will stop dying. It's not when US aid stops, because US aid stopped for many months and Ukrainians kept dying because Russians were invading their country. US aid is not going to kill additional Ukrainians. It's actually going to help kill Russians because you're there. But if you want to stop Russians from dying, you only have to leave.